So here we have Solderbox by Bram Bos and myself. It's a semi-modular workstation, meaning that the modules have been predefined, and so you can't just switch them out like you can on an actual modular synthesizer. Plus, some of the modules are also normalized, which means that they're connected in the background. So even without having to use the patch bay, you can still play this thing and tweak the knobs and do some awesome sounds on it. Now, Solderbox has been very much inspired by the work I did building my own haQ Modular version 1. It's a Eurorack system, and it is the first part of this huge sound lab I've got planned out. I recently published a video on my channel about it and how it took me a year to build because it's all DIY. So how is all of this related to Solderbox? Well, I put specific modules into Solderbox because I have a particular type of workflow and I want to be able to get anything done with my sound lab. And that sound lab feeling is something that we wanted reflected in Solderbox. And on top of that, also that quirky behavior that a modular has because it's an analog system where you're working with voltages. Another nice thing about the modular workflow is how some modules can be used for many things. The envelope generator can easily be turned into an LFO. The mixer has two modes where one lets you mix, the other one lets you multiply, basically allowing you to do ring modulation stuff. If you want to slew or filter a modulation signal through the filter, you can do that. It all depends on the intentions of the user. And that is what is so nice about the modular workflow. Even the sequencer has a very modular thing too. You see, it doesn't work like a normal straightforward step sequencer really. No, it's actually built up of 3 LFOs and is very well suited for making generative melodies. In any case, this entire project, me starting out building my own Eurorack system and then trying to meticulously boil that entire experience down into an app, is something that has been going on for about 2 years now. And both me and Bram can't wait to see what you do with it. It feels great to finally be able to present you with Solderbox. Let's start with some very light basics and have a look at the lower right corner. Here we have the preset list, we also have a quick save button, and then we have something called trigger. This gives you the ability to actually trigger a sound from Solderbox without having to connect a keyboard and or a sequencer. Now, on top of this, you have a polyphony switch down here, and when you turn it on, you have up to 3 voices that you can play at the same time. Hey, if you're an ambient people, by the way, there is a drone mode in Solderbox. You see, the envelope generator is normaled to the VCA, meaning it's directly controlling the VCA even though you haven't even routed anything. But if you flip this switch, you are disengaging the envelope generator and the VCA opens up fully and Solderbox just starts blasting sound. Alright, so let's talk about Solderbox workflow. You see, it was basically designed to be a semi-modular workstation instrument. So it can run as a standalone thing, or it can be loaded as an AUv3 plugin instrument inside your most favorite AUv3 host. However, we decided to add something extra to this to make it feel really modular. And so you can also load Solderbox as an effect plugin inside your AUv3 host. Now, when you're doing that, you're turning one of the oscillators into an audio input. And now you get to use whatever is coming in there as a modulation source, or you can process the audio coming in through it. The limitation of Solderbox is, of course, that it is a mono synth with a stereo delay effect. So if you're sending in audio through it and you're wondering why it sounds weird, it's because it's basically summing down the stereo into a mono signal. Now we're gonna have a look at the patch bay and signal flow in a little bit, but first I want to bring you back to the preset browser, because in here we have 140 presets made by myself and also Bram Bos. And these are here to show you the capabilities of Solderbox and the wide range of different genres you can work with, and also different synthesis techniques. And so if you're a beginner, you can learn a lot by just deconstructing some of these presets. Now, if we look closer, we can see that there are 4 distinct categories in here. The abstract and generative categories are filled with presets that will just autoplay when you select them, because they're both generative categories. However, the instrument category is filled with presets that were designed to be played by you. So you'll have to connect an external keyboard, either hardware or software one, or maybe a sequencer, or you could start building your own sequence using the Pulsequencer inside Solderbox. Now, the presets inside the last category, the AUFX one, were designed to be used for when you've got Solderbox loaded as an effect plugin inside an AUv3 host. Basically, these presets were made to process sounds that you're sending into Solderbox. Next, I want to talk about the patch bay, signal flow, and normalization. You see, some of the modules are normalized, meaning they are already connected in certain ways when you're not using the patch bay. If we look here on the right side, we can actually see this default routing of the modules. The oscillators are going into the shapers, shapers into the filter, filter into the VCA, and then the envelope generator is affecting the VCA. So these connections are already routed in the background and you don't have to do anything, you can just play the synthesizer straight away. However, let's say we wanted to switch some stuff around here, because it is very different working with a filter that is going into the shaper instead of the other way around. Well, that means that we're gonna have to work with the patch bay. The first thing I want to highlight is the highlights, no pun intended. Basically, this brighter area around some of the jacks. And this is something we've adopted from the modular world. So basically, these are inputs and these are outputs. And it's the same thing in Solderbox. These are inputs and these are outputs. Now, in order to make a connection, you need to drag an output to an input or an input to an output. Now, the next thing to highlight is color coding. As you can see, there is a lot of colors in here, even though Solderbox is mostly gray. And this color palette has been borrowed from my MOOdular. Now, the cables will also be color coded, and what actually decides their color is the section you're dragging from. And you can easily control this. So let's say we wanted to build our patch. Well, we're gonna need to route our oscillator 1 output to the filter input. And when we do it this way, the cable becomes blue. And if we do it the other way around, well, we get a purple one. It's still the same connection, but yeah, like I said, you can control the colors of your cables. Now, let's just keep the color consistency here. So from oscillator to filter input, from filter output to the shaper input. And lastly, we're gonna pull from the shaper to the VCA, but yeah, I'm gonna do it the other way around. We have now circumvented the normalization that goes on when you don't use the patch cable and switched the order between the filter and shaper, which is a very different coupling to work with. And you wanna do this if you're into acid type stuff. Now, there is a feature in here that isn't that obvious. If you look at Solderbox, you can see that there are no mults built into it. And a mult, for those of you who don't know, is basically a module like this, where you can easily split up a signal or merge a signal. And we didn't put any of those into Solderbox. However, you are able to stack outputs of cables by long pressing on an output and dragging. You can get a new cable that you can route anywhere. Now, there are a lot of modules that provide me with a lot of features inside my Modular, and we couldn't possibly fit all of that workflow inside Solderbox, but we did try to emulate that SoundLab feeling and some of the workflow I have with my Modular in Solderbox. The oscillator section inside Solderbox has been inspired by the workflow I have with 3 modules inside my Modular. These 3 modules provide me with all the basic waveforms, a way of doing FM synthesis, and I get to have a supersaw mode on top of it all. So we have 3 knobs at the top here, 2 of them being tuning knobs for oscillator 1 and 2 basically just controlling the pitch. Then the 3rd knob in the middle here is the frequency modulation knob, and it allows us to use oscillator 2 to frequency modulate oscillator 1, basically giving us FM synthesis. Now, if we move our eyes down here, we can see that we have waveform selectors here, which gives us all the basic waveforms. And on top of that, it also gives us a unison mode. And when we switch over to that, the FM knob turns into a detuning mode for that unison mode and basically allows us to dial in the type of supersaw sound that we want. The last knob, which is the glide knob, is a portamento knob and will control the amount of pitch bending that happens between notes. Now, in the patch bay, we have CV control over oscillator 1 and 2, including FM amount, plus individual outputs for oscillator 1 and 2. So the Wavesurgeon has been heavily inspired by the rectifinuverter, which rectifies, attenuates, and inverts. And what does that mean? Well, if you take a bipolar signal, which is basically a signal that swings from plus voltage down to minus voltage across a point of equilibrium, which is 0 volts, and you take a scalpel and you drag it along the middle here, well, you're basically going to end up with two signals. One of them containing only what's going on the minus side, and the other one containing only what's going on the plus side. And those two are then being outputted individually here and here. Now, that creates some very interesting modulation waveforms if you're working with control voltages like LFOs and stuff like that. But you can also feed it audio rate signals like oscillators. Now, the best part here, though, is this summing output, which basically stitches the two sides back together again. And that is really uninteresting if you're just using one input, because you're ending up with the same waveform as you're feeding the module. No, you also have to use the second input and make sure that that second input is being fed a different type of waveform. And you can also have it running at a different rate, because now you're ending up with a Frankenstein waveform. It is a super nerdy module, and it's very rare to find something like this inside software instruments or hardware instruments unless they're modular in some way. There are so many methods of manipulating waveforms. The Wavesurgeon cuts things apart and then puts them together again. But then there's clipping, there's overdrive, and wave shaping, wave folding, and that's exactly what the shaper section is about. The main inspiration for this section comes from the fact that I love reshaping waveforms in every way that I can. I mean, I put 3 modules in here that does just that, for crying out loud, and that's a lot for a small system like this. And if you look at this, you can see that we are covering a lot of bases. Apart from wave folding and wave bending, we also have a polynomial distortion algorithm, and then a good old drive, and we're finishing up with a weird 8-bit crushing effect called reduce. So we're gonna have a look at the noise and random section, and even though it looks kind of minimalistic with only 2 knobs, this section does quite a lot. Now, if we focus in on the noise first, this one has been inspired by the fact that I try to put all types of noise that I could have into my modular. I have 2 modules that pretty much provide me with that, and in Solderbox we wanted something similar. Now, we didn't put all in there, but through Bram's coding genius, we can go all the way from brown noise over to white noise, all the way over to a grainy type noise, so we can make Geiger counter sounds. So if we look at the patch bay here, we can see that we've got the noise output right down here. And then we also have an input for modulation where we can control the amplitude or level for the noise. Now, noise can be used in so many ways. You can use it as an actual sound source, or you can use it as a modulation source. And one of the things noise is used for very often is sample and hold modules, which is exactly what the random is. Now, one of the things I really want to highlight here is that even though the knob is over here, the actual patch bay options for it is all the way over here. And when you route cables from this section, you actually end up with chartreuse colored cables. So what is the knob actually for? Well, it sets the range of the sampled values. So if you want to generate smaller values from the random output, you just dial this knob down counterclockwise. And if you want the full range, you just dial it all the way up clockwise. Now, in the default state, the triggering mechanics for the sample and hold is already normal to the cycle of the envelope generator. So whenever the envelope generator is triggered, it's also triggering the sample and hold. But you can circumvent that by using the random trigger input here. And here you can input the Pulsequencer trigger, or you can even use an LFO. Now, the filter inside Solderbox is of a 4-pole ladder style filter. And we put that in there because that's exactly what I have in my modular, 2 4-pole ladder style filters. Why mess with something that works? Now, we only put one of them inside Solderbox, but it is switchable between 1, 2, 3, and 4 poles. And then you have a dedicated drive knob for adding a bit of distortion to the filtering. In the end, we end up with a really nice sounding filter, and it doesn't sound like the ones I already have. Now, if we look at the patch bay, apart from the filter input and output, we also have full CV control over the cutoff, resonance, and also envelope mod. Now, the Solderbox LFO section has not been inspired by any particular module in my modular. It's more like us just trying to cover all of the basics and then adding a little bit of extra on top. Now, the two LFOs will provide you with all the basic waveforms, including sample and hold, so there's even more randomness going on in here. Both LFOs can be synced, or you can have them free running. But if you look at the switch here, there's 3 modes. In this one, both of the LFOs are running free. In this one, the first one is synced, the other one isn't. And in this one, both LFOs are synced. Now you can set the rates with these 2 controls, of course. And these 2 controls can also be CV controlled down here in the patch bay. Lastly, if we look at the patch bay, we can see that there are 3 outputs. There's one for each LFO, and then there is a third one where both of them are mixed together. Now, the envelope generator has not been inspired by any particular module in my rack. However, it's got a typical West Coast type design when it comes to function modules like this. So it's sporting a rise and fall generator with 2 knobs. On top of that, there is an optional sustain switch here for when you want to play longer sounds other than just plucky sounds. And then we have a curving knob down here, which will allow us to shape and slew the signal further. Now, on top of that, there is a loop switch, and when you turn that on, you're turning the EG into an LFO instead. Now, if we move down to the patch bay, we can see that we have an EG gate input here, and this is for triggering the envelope generator. Now, it's already normaled in the default state to the trigger button here, and the same goes for when you have a keyboard connected to Solderbox, and there is no patching needed. However, if you want to trigger the envelope generator with anything else, like an LFO, or maybe the trigger output of the sequencer, well, that's what you use this input for. Now, there are 2 inputs for modulating the rise and fall knobs, and then there are 2 outputs. The main output is the one at the bottom called EG out, and then there is one called cycle loop, and it will actually output a trigger signal at the end of every cycle, whether you've got the envelope generator looping or not. The last module in the pink section is called Utility because it does a lot of stuff, and it draws its inspiration from, well, my rack and the fact that I have utilities all over the place. By the way, my Utopia doesn't look like this anymore. It looks like this now because of my color OCD. Right, so the utility module is a 3-channel mixer. It can mix both audio and or CV, and you have a main output down here, but then there is a special output just for channel 1. You see, it has a built-in filter that you can control with the slew knob here. And it might not be as fun to use with audio signal as it is when you're using it with CV signal, because when you're doing that, you can actually reshape the signal further. There is actually one more thing about channel 1, and that is the fact that when you've got nothing plugged into the input, it has been normal to a constant signal that it puts out in the output here. So if we wire that output up to the cutoff input, then we can control the cutoff with this knob. Now, if we use the built-in mult and long press on the output and drag another patch cable to the shape receive input, we can now control both of these features with one knob. We've basically built a macro. Now there are 2 more features. One of them is right there on the faceplate and the other one is kind of hidden. So most importantly, this switch over here sets the mode and behavior for the utility module. When you're in edition mode, the utility module works pretty much like a mixer for CV and audio. And when you're mixing audio, it's nice to add some drive to your signal, and that's the hidden feature. When you pull up on these knobs, the last bit of the knob actually adds some overdrive with a bit of soft saturation at the main output of the mixer. Now, when we switch this over to multiplication mode, it changes the behavior of the utility module, and now it allows you to multiply signals up and basically do ring modulation instead. Now, on top of that, all of the attenuators or the volume controls are actually bipolar. All of the knobs have a center detent at the top here, and this is basically 0. Tweaking the knob clockwise will not invert the signal. However, when you're tweaking the knob counterclockwise, you are inverting the signal and basically flipping it upside down. Something I want to highlight with the bipolar knobs is that they will actually show you that they are bipolar with these colored lines here on the side. It's a really nice detail that Bram added. I often use LFOs as some kind of simple sequencer for making drum sounds. But when you want to make melodies, you need a few more modules. You need the trigger and you need some way of controlling the value output so that you can make melodies. And so when you add those modules and you mix several LFOs together, you get what we have right here, the Pulse Sequencer. It is a generative sequencer that doesn't work like a conventional sequencer. order to explain how it really works, I have to show you this graph. You see, as soon as you wire up the Pulsequencer, it starts running. And that means that you have 3 LFOs constantly swinging up and down in parallel. And there's really nothing stopping it. There are 2 important values being generated here. One is a trigger and the other one is a note value. So if we look at the graph, we can see that when LFOs are swinging up, we also get a trigger and a note. So at least one of the LFOs has to be swinging up in order for a note to be generated. And when all of the LFOs are swinging down, you get a rest, meaning no note is being generated. But when a note is being generated, the note value will be decided by a summing of all 3 LFOs, meaning we can have up to 8 note combinations, including the rest. What's interesting here is that you don't have that many controls to control the sequencer with. You got 2 sets of knobs over here, where the first row of knobs controls the rates for the pulsing, and you got 16 different rate settings to choose from. Now, you get the lower rates when you tweak the knob counterclockwise, and you get the higher rates when you tweak the knob clockwise. The second row of knobs sets the pitch for each LFO. Now, in an analog hardware modular synthesizer, you really do need some sort of a quantizer, preferably one that lets you set some note scales in order to get some musically sounding notes out of your voltages. And we put such a thing inside Solderbox. And so if we press this button, we get this window here. And here we get a basic set of scales to choose from. Not only that, we can also select the root key over here, and if none of the scales really tickles your fancy, then you can make your own by tapping and untapping notes in the keyboard. Now, once you're done with that, whenever you're tweaking this row of knobs here, you're basically selecting a note from within that scale. But it doesn't quite stop there. You see, if you're using Solderbox inside an AUv3 host and the host is clocked at 120 BPM, well, as soon as you flip this, the sequencer will be running at half that speed, meaning 60 BPMs. On top of that, the second button will allow you to switch between a high and low octave. And on top of that, when you've got a keyboard connected to Solderbox, whether it's hardware or a software keyboard, you can actually transport the entire sequence up and down in pitch by playing different notes. And if we look at the patch bay, there is some interesting stuff you can do, because the quantizer inside the sequencer can be used with other things. For instance, check out what happens when I run an envelope generator through it or an LFO. And this highlights one of the things that I like the most about the modular world, and that is that a thing is rarely just the thing it says it is. Now, there is one more input here I haven't talked about, and that is the mutate input. And this can be very helpful because even though the Pulsequencer was designed to be very generative, it is still possible to generate very repetitive patterns with it. Now, I'm not going to say much about the VCA or voltage controlled amplifier because it's basically like a volume control for Solderbox. And in the default state with the switch in this mode, it is normal to the envelope generator. And then if you don't want to use the envelope generator but something else, you patch it into this input. The only thing that you need to think about is that if you flip this switch to on, where Solderbox just starts blaring sound because it's basically like a drone mode, well, you're also decoupling this input. And so if you want to use that input, you have to switch it back to EG. The last module in the chain is the delay effect. We call it entropy, and for this one, I begged Bram to put in something extremely dirty, something really, really nasty. And when he told me that
I have a delay effect,
I said,
yeah, boy.
And Bram wasn't kidding. No, because this delay is noisy and dirty as f***. And some of you might not like it in the end, but that's fine because chances are that you already have a favorite delay that you can throw into the mixer anyway. And if you turn the feedback knob down to 0 counterclockwise, the delay basically turns off and you can't hear it. So yeah. Now, the two timing knobs can be used individually, or you can link them to have them move in unison. Now, there is one more thing inside Solderbox that you can't really see, but you might be able to sense it or hear it sometimes. It's called the instability engine, and it's there to simulate leaky signals, crosstalk between different modules and components, and also fluctuations in the voltages, because that's what it's like actually using an analog modular synthesizer like this. You see, if you actually take a closer look at some of my modules and you go over their specifications, you'll see that I have sometimes used different components than what the schematics actually called for, or different values, because I wanted a different behavior out of my modular in particular. And sometimes I've been using some components I've been saving for 25 years, so they're old, so I'm not sure if they are really working as they should. But the cool thing with that is that all of those imperfections are what amounts to the character of my modular, and it makes it unique. Now, me and Bram wanted that to be reflected inside Solderbox, which is why we added the instability engine. We're not talking about big changes like the sequencer suddenly just changing a note into something it shouldn't be. No, we're talking small changes, as if the system is almost breathing, as if you're almost working with voltages. Now, the funny thing here is that you can take all of that analog sounding goodness and send it straight through the most noisy digitally sounding delay ever. And I just love contrasts like that. Now, there's one last thing I want to show you, and it is this very nice looking poster that Bram made. It is a PDF Solderbox manual filled with illustrations, screenshots, information about what the ins and outs do. And over here you can see the nice illustration Bram made over the Pulsequencer that I borrowed for the video. Now, if you want to go and download this gorgeous looking manual after purchasing Solderbox, then go down into the comment section, check the pinned comment, and you'll find a link to Solderbox, the manual, and also a picture of this goat. Every copy sold of Solderbox will help sustain the lives of two extreme nerds with no friends that struggle with either explaining or making amazing music apps. And that is something you should really want to support. Now, don't just go and buy Solderbox just because I said it. Go buy Solderbox just because I said it. Please love me. Now, I want to take this opportunity to thank Bram for a great co-op here. It's been pleasantly interesting to try to boil down an entire year's worth of experience with building a Eurorack system into an app. And it wouldn't have been possible without Bram Bos's coding genius. Now, I also want to thank all of my patrons for supporting me through hard times, and all of you in the audience who have been continuously watching me for the past decade and supporting my work and commenting and liking the videos and all of that stuff. You don't know how much it means to me, and you don't know how much you mean to me. So thank you so much. Before you leave, why don't you press that thumbs up if you want to support my work here on YouTube, and if you don't want to support my work here on YouTube, press that thumbs up. Now, as usual, I wish you a very productive week. Now go finger all of your stuff and have a lot of fun doing it.